So Professor Matthew Bowman joins us this morning or this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are in the world. Professor Bowman is a professor of history and religion at Claremont Graduate University in California. And he joins us today for the Society's January Colloquium, which ushers in for us a new year of lectures, academic courses, and other events at the Society. Professor Bowman serves as the Howard W. Hunter Chair of Mormon Studies at Claremont, and his work focuses on the history of new religious movements in the United States. He is the author or editor of a half-dozen books so far. Most recently, of course, Professor Bowman tackled the famous Betty and Barney Hill's abduction case, in which the witnesses involved eventually claimed to not only have witnessed what we would call a UAP, in that case, I believe it was a light in the sky, right? But to also have interacted with beings associated with that. The abduction of Betty and Barney Hills, the alien encounters, civil rights, and the New Age in America, published by Yale University Press in 2023, and released in paperback form, I believe, in early this year, 2025, is a fascinating and rich historical account of this oft-cited case in the UFO world, and should prove to be a standard reference, I think, here for many years to come. In Professor Bowman's introduction to the text, he writes that the, quote, "the Hills story is more than a story about the couple themselves and their strange experiences, whatever they may have been. It is a story about two Americans and what they believed it was to be an American in the middle decades of the 20th century. It is the story," he continues, "of how those beliefs were tested and how the Hills, like so many other Americans, came to believe something different about the world than they once had." End quote. To kick off our discussion of Professor Bowman's important text, we are joined this afternoon by anthropologist Dr. William Dewan of the University of California at Irvine. Dr. Dewan has studied abduction and UAP encounter narratives for many years now, first publishing in 2006 an essay entitled "A Saucer Full of Secrets." Many of you may know this. An interdisciplinary analysis of UFO experiences in the Journal of American Folklore, and is currently teaching a course for us here at the Society called UFOs and American Culture. Dr. Dewan is also editing an important anthology of works by academics presently studying the UFO phenomenon, a volume for which many of us here, of course, owe you a paper of our very own. So welcome, everybody. Good morning, good evening. Good afternoon. So Professor Bowman, the floor is yours. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. And I am going to, if I might, share my screen. There we are. Great. I want to do a couple of things here this morning. The first is to talk a bit about the Hills themselves, their experience, but then, and you know, the ways I interpret it in my book. But then I want to maybe do something a little odd. I decided to do this yesterday and kind of critique myself, and offer some alternative ways of thinking about what happened to Betty and Barney Hill, other than the way I offer in this text. So first, and thus you see here, 3 ways of looking at the UFO, or 6. Those 3 being ways that I unpack in the book, those other ways I think being ways in which I might critique my own work. First, then, a bit of background to Betty and Barney Hill. They married in May of 1960 in New Jersey, and it was the second marriage for both of them. Betty Hill was born in Kingston, New Hampshire, where she grew up. She married a man in 1941 who proved to be abusive. She left him after his children, whom she helped to raise, were grown, And then she did something fairly remarkable. She went back to college. She pursued a career as a social worker, and bought a home. She was then working, living in her house, when she reconnected with Barney Hill, whom she had met a few years earlier. Barney, for his part, grew up in Philadelphia. His parents were part of the Great Migration of African Americans to northern cities that happened in the 1910s and 1920s. They went there looking for work. He grew up in a decently off household. His father was a postal worker, and Barney followed his father into that path. He married as well. He and his first wife met Betty actually while on vacation, and after Barney's divorce, he reached out to Betty again. They began a courtship and married, as I said, in 1960. He worked for the post office. He transferred from Philadelphia to Boston after the marriage. Boston is a lot closer to Portsmouth than Philadelphia is, but still fairly far. And he was driving about an hour and a half each way to work. He worked the night shifts. After they'd been married for quite a while, because of his work, they never really had a vacation or a honeymoon. And so Barney asked for a few days off on September 17th, 1961. The plan they made was to drive west across upstate New York, to cross into Canada near Niagara Falls, to loop around through Montreal, and to drive back home. This they did, although they cut the trip a bit short because of weather. The night of September 19th, 1961, they crossed into New Hampshire, the northern tip, near a town called Colebrook. There they stopped at a diner and had a late dinner. They recalled it was about 10 o'clock when they left. And then they drove down New Hampshire Route 3 for a while, which is today partly covered by an interstate. And as they approached Franconia Notch, which is a large mountainous region in the center of the state, they saw something strange, a light in the sky. Now, I want to stop there. We tend to often, in the media and many narratives about this encounter, tell stories like this backward, which is to say we start from the latest accounts, which are often the fullest accounts, and we simply just leap right into them. And if we do that with Betty and Barney Hill, we say that they were, in the United States at least, the first alien abduction, which is a term that carries a lot of resonance for us today. But what I want to do here is the reverse. I want to go forward with Betty and Barney Hill. That is, start with some of the earliest sources we have about what they said happened to them. And we can see then, if we do that, how their story in some ways builds upon itself, how it begins to interact with other narratives of American life and American culture. And I think if we do that, we can see three different ways the Hills described what happened to them, and how these three different ways kind of bound in with other stories about what it meant to be an American in the middle decades of the 20th century. And when you see them listed here, in 1961, they called what they had seen a flying saucer. In 1964, they began talking in the terms that we would now recognize as an abduction. And then later, contact. And what I mean by that, I will explain when I get there. So in their earliest sources, the Hills call what they saw a flying saucer. And that word, of course, or that phrase emerges from the famous Kenneth Arnold sighting in 1947, in which Arnold describes seeing three strange objects that move, he says, like discs skipping over the water. The media coins the term flying saucer. And then over the next few years, there is what is sometimes called a flap, right? A whole lot of sightings of these things. And this category of flying saucer, which the media invented, takes on new meaning. It becomes a really capacious net for all sorts of strange things that people see in the sky. I want to, though, focus on one aspect of that term, which is to say this idea of flying saucer implies something material, and something built. That is, people are imagining this thing as an object that was made, not unlike the aircraft that the US Air Force were piloting. And because it is imagined to be technology rather than something immaterial or something supernatural, like an angel or whatnot, flying saucers quickly become the provenance of the state. And a particular type of state, the national security state, which emerged out of World War II. A 6-year period in which the United States devoted vast amounts of resources to national defense, to the military, and increasingly to science, which was viewed as something in concert with the military. And this, of course, becomes what eventually President Dwight Eisenhower will call the military-industrial complex, an interweaving of institutions of higher education, of the US military, and of corporations, defense contractors like Lockheed Martin or McDonnell Douglas. So it is very, very quickly assumed by representatives of the state that these strange things in the sky are under the domain, the purview of the US military. And thus we get Project Sign, Project Grudge, Project Blue Book, these 3 investigations. It's also true, though, that mode of belief, that way of thinking about strange things in the sky is communicated pretty quickly to American citizens as well. And Betty and Barney Hill are a good example of this. The next morning, after they woke up at home, Betty Hill called her sister Janet to tell Janet that she had seen something strange in the sky the night before. Janet, who lives in Kingston, only a few towns over from Portsmouth, had in her home a family friend, someone who was only called Buzz in the materials that we have. Buzz is a police officer, and Buzz tells Betty she should call the local Air Force Base and report this sighting. And Betty thinks this is a great idea, and she does. Betty is very enthusiastic about doing this. Barney less so. And I think that reveals something about politics in the United States in the mid-20th century. This is a time, we have to remember, in which a Gallup poll showed only a year before the Hills' experience that upward of 75% of Americans said they trusted the government to do the right thing in most or all situations. Those are numbers kind of unimaginable to us today, but they reveal, I think, how Americans are thinking about the Cold War. There's a real trust in the state, and also as well a sense of efficacy. That is to say, a sense that citizens could influence the state, that the state would be responsive to people. And Betty wants to do this. She believes herself to be a good citizen. She's a supporter at that point of actually the Democratic Party. She'd been a big supporter of the New Deal. During Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, she had been involved in unions for most of her life, right? She had a real sense of the power of citizens to affect the state. And so she thought calling would be a great idea. Barney is more hesitant. And we'll say more about why in a moment. But here you see the very first written source we have for the Hill experience. This is a report filed by a man named Captain Paul Henderson on September 21st, 1961. He is an officer on Pease Air Force Base who eventually the Hills get a hold of, and they tell him this story. And you can see, if you were to look closely at this document, some of the language, I think, that is associated with flying saucers. That is to say, they describe this thing as a craft. They say it has wings and a light, right? All language reminiscent of jet airplanes, right? Not to say that it was a jet airplane, but it is to say they're thinking of it in the same category, something built, technology, flying in the sky. Now, later on in their memories, Barney will say he was reluctant to talk to Henderson because he did not want to be considered what Barney called a kook. Barney associates the term flying saucer with kooks. And I think we see in that some of Barney's own anxieties. He is a Black man in the United States, of course. He is involved in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the largest civil rights organization in the country, and one which practiced what historians call the politics of respectability. In short, the politics of respectability are why Martin Luther King always wore a suit. Barney is particularly conscious of his need to be taken seriously. And for him, flying saucers are not something to be taken seriously. You see some of that in the second document describing the Hill experience, and that is a letter that Betty Hill writes to Donald Kehoe 5 days after the Henderson report. In the interim, she says she went to the library, she checked out one of Donald Kehoe's books, and she thought Donald Kehoe could be useful to her. Now, Kehoe, of course, is an ex-military officer. He is a writer. He is a very big advocate for two things. One we'll get to in a moment, but right here I want to say that Kehoe is a big advocate for the flying saucer interpretation of lights in the sky. Kehoe believes, and he says, that these things are mechanical craft. They are built and on other planets and flown here. And you see some of that in this description, right? Betty draws on Kehoe's own writings to describe the thing that she saw. And she also says here that her husband was deeply alarmed by this thing because he saw figures inside it as he looked at it through binoculars. And that Barney is still deeply distressed by this for two possible reasons, one being fear, but the other being, again, Barney is fearful for his reputation. But note again, right, that notion that there were creatures on this craft, again, offers us the interpretation of flying saucer. That is an object not unlike an airplane. The third source we have was produced at the instigation of Kehoe, who is helping to run the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, one of the early UFO research groups. Kehoe sends an investigator, a young man named Walter Webb, who was an astronomer in Boston, up to interview the Hills. And Webb does so about a month after the event, and then he produces a report for NICAP. And you see in this report a real fixation on that idea of flying saucer. Webb uses the term UFO, which by that point was a term used by the military itself, because, of course, the connotations of the term flying saucer, as Barney observes, with kooks. These people investigating it want it to be taken more seriously than that, so they use this other term. But the term still connotes all of these things that flying saucer did. That is material, technology, a craft. And Webb's language is suffused with this idea. He also certainly describes as well Barney's worry. In fact, in this report, Webb describes a conversation that the Hills had as they were driving home to Portsmouth after this odd sighting. Betty asks her husband, "Do you believe in flying saucers now?" And Barney says, "Don't be ridiculous," which is a fascinating exchange. Right? It reveals a couple of things also which are bolstered by the Webb report. The first is that Betty indeed had a pre-existing familiarity with the culture and language of flying saucers. Webb reports in this document that Betty's sister Janet had seen a strange object in the sky a few years before, that she and Betty had spoken about this, that Betty was familiar with the jargon, but also that Barney's refusal to say that he believed in flying saucers after seeing this thing does not mean that Barney is denying having seen something. Rather, it is a rejection on Barney's part of the assumptions that come with the idea of the quote-unquote flying saucer. which Barney associates with kooks. So I think we see, right, in these earliest accounts of the Hill experience, a lot of the assumptions that they gathered out of the culture around them. Faith in the state, trust in the state, a belief in respectability politics, at least on Barney's part, right? This desire to be taken seriously, and the sort of emerging politics around the phenomenon of flying saucers themselves, this assumption that they are technology, that they are material, and this vague air of disrepute that is surrounding them by the early 1960s. Now, the Hills go on after this. Initially, very little happens, except for what comes in retrospect, I think, to seem somewhat significant. That is psychic distress on the part of the Hills. Betty is having nightmares. Barney develops an ulcer. And that sense of the psychological impact of these things goes somewhat beyond, I think, the simply technological interpretation into different realms. Realms that will eventually make the Hills increasingly distrustful of the state, and link this idea of distrust of the state to the phenomenon of abduction. Now, we return here to Donald Keyhoe. Donald Keyhoe, as I said earlier, was a great advocate for the flying saucer interpretation of strange things in the sky. He is also an advocate for conspiracy, but conspiracy of a particular sort. That is, conspiracy of the sort that was the underbelly of Americans' faith in the state during the Cold War. That is, the growing sense that the state is keeping things secret. The great example of this, and an example that Keyhoe sometimes points to, is the Manhattan Project. Of course, the development of the atomic bomb, and the sense that secrecy is a function of national security. And again, we see, right, the national security state emerging here and the significance of that in how these people are thinking about these things. Keyhoe argues that the state knows far more than it is telling about technology, about science, about the things going on with these strange flying saucers. He does not embrace the connections between this distrust and Americans' growing awe of hypnosis, their growing sense of the psychological as a way to interpret the world, but other people do, because this is also a great period of fascination with psychology. The post-war period is a period we might call that of the popularization of psychology, both as a practice. Being in counseling, being in therapy, being in psychoanalysis becomes increasingly common, in part because of the great publicity given to psychology in the post-war period. But it is also, I think, at the same time, a period of growing kind of awe and terror at what psychology might accomplish. And this is largely spread in the popular press by, well, films and books like The Manchurian Candidate, the poster that you see there, right? Emerging out of the Korean War, and the term brainwashing, which is coined during the Korean War to describe the kind of torture that North Korean and Chinese militaries were wreaking on American POWs. The Manchurian Candidate and other media like it offers a vision of an extraordinarily powerful discipline of psychology and psychiatry. The idea that the human mind can be programmed or reprogrammed, that personalities can be altered or destroyed, right? These are all things that increasingly professionals in this field would dispute. The term brainwashing is largely debunked by academics, for instance, but they're widely believed, and especially the notion that hypnosis can really alter people's minds becomes very compelling to a lot of Americans in this period. And it is then by the 1970s, people are connecting that sense of the dark underbelly of the Cold War security state with the power of psychology to unpack some really, really compelling narratives. And you see the power of the idea of hypnosis entering the UFO world, certainly with the Hills, but it really reaches an apotheosis after the 1970s. The 70s being, of course, this moment when American citizens largely turn on the state because of the failure of the war in Vietnam, because the revelations of what was then called the Church Committee, which was quite famous in the mid-70s, but is little remembered now. This is a congressional committee that unearths the fact that the CIA had plotted assassinations and had overthrown governments and all sorts of things like that. And of course, the real national trauma of the Watergate scandal. These real triple blows do a lot to cripple American faith in the state. And by the 1980s, then you are seeing Kehoe-style conspiracies being plugged into this kind of popular fascination with psychology. Of course, Bud Hopkins's famous investigations of UFOs do a lot to popularize that idea of hypnosis and the power of psychology to uncover lost memories. Hopkins occasionally nods to conspiracy, but other people in Hopkins's circle, like, for instance, David Jacobs, most particularly, and of course, the famous Matrix documents of John Grace, do a lot to connect abduction, hypnosis, memory, and forgetting to conspiracy. And the Hills are, in some ways, the first people who take steps towards what becomes this ultimate narrative. In November 1960, Betty Hill produces this document called Dreams or Recall. And you see, as you will in a number of these other documents, the shadow of my telephone on the bottom right. Betty, as best I can tell, produces this document in November 1961. And it is a narrative of dreams that she had over the couple of weeks following the September 1961 experience, which to this point she thinks is only about lights in the sky. Now, often we may simply plunge right into the text and what she says here, but I really want to draw your attention to the fourth paragraph of this document, in which Betty says, "I will attempt to tell my dreams in chronological order, although they are not dreamed in this way." That's, I think, an enormously significant sentence. Not necessarily, to debunk it and say, well, she's making all this up. I don't think that's the case at all. But I do think this is significant because it tells us something about what Betty thinks about dreams. Betty was trained in her social work program with Freudian psychology. She was told that dreams mean something, that dreams are to be interpreted, that dreams have significance. So she thinks, right, as she is imagining or pondering what these dreams might mean, she thinks she should examine them, that she should unpack them, that they will have some sort of revelation for her. And that's what she tries to do. That's, I think, a really significant and often overlooked first step. It shows the impact of psychological ways of thinking on mid-20th century Americans, and it shows that Betty Hill is an eager participant in those formulations. Next, of course, in part deriving from this faith in Freudian analysis, in psychology and psychiatry as a whole, as broader disciplines. Eventually, of course, Betty and Barney Hill are referred to Benjamin Simon, a psychiatrist, a hypnotherapist. And Simon tells the Hills something important before he hypnotizes them. He tells them that hypnosis can reveal emotional truth, but it should not be assumed to reveal literal truth. Because, he says, memory is not a series of boxes in a closet in your brain that you go to and open every time you want to remember something. Rather, memory is a process. Memory is something that we construct every time we remember something, which means, of course, that memory is always shaded by our present circumstances. And so he tells them that hypnosis may recover emotional truth, but not literal truth. It can reveal how they are feeling about these strange events, but it might not reveal the events themselves. The Hills don't believe him. And I think they don't believe him in part because they are conditioned by the stories of the awesome power of hypnosis that American culture is steeped in the mid 20th century. And in fact, that Simon tells them that the story they recover from hypnosis, he doubts the veracity of. That's a real break for the Hills. And of course, the story that emerges under hypnosis is a story that mirrors in some degree Betty's dreams. That is, the light they saw in the sky lands on the road in front of them. Small creatures disembark. They carry the Hills back on board and separate them. The Hills describe medical-ish examinations, which involves some trauma for both of them, especially trauma surrounding their reproductive organs. Barney says that a cup is placed over his genitals and that semen is extracted, although he does not describe having an erection, and he notes that as being odd. Betty describes a long needle inserted in her belly button. She also describes conversations with these creatures who take her on board, especially one whom she calls the leader, who she says can communicate with her in English. They discuss where these creatures came from. He shows her a map, although she cannot identify anything on the map. She begs them to come back. Barney, on the other hand, describes terror. His eyes are closed almost the entire time. He says the aliens make vocalizations, but he cannot understand what they are. He is petrified for the entire experience. Simon, in the good kind of Freudian way, interprets this as he would a dream. He says this is a product of the anxieties they felt on the trip, racial anxieties in particular. Barney does describe under hypnosis encountering, or I shouldn't say encountering, experiencing a lot of racial fear. He is worried that they will be turned away at hotels. He packs a gun in their car because he is afraid of violent confrontation. He is suspicious of people they meet. Simon believes that this kind of anxiety meant that Barney was on edge, that Betty was on edge. When they left their trip early because of a storm, they were tense. They argued about this strange light in the sky, and Betty's dreams then reflect that anxiety. She communicated those dreams in Barney's hearing, which she does, or she says that she did not tell Barney about the dreams. Barney says he heard her tell someone else about them. And those dreams then, derived from this anxiety, produce this story of abduction. The Hills reject this. And indeed, you see in that rejection the first cracks of faith in the American establishment. They say, or Barney writes in a later letter, that Simon is afraid of being attacked by his peers, and that's why he won't admit the truth. Increasingly then, over the next few years, the Hills grow suspicious of authorities, traditional authorities. They grow suspicious of the state. Betty Hill, by the 1970s, is producing documents like this, Mystery Helicopters, in which she describes strange black helicopters overhead. She describes seeing other UFOs being followed by strange black helicopters. And she writes in this document that she calls everybody she can think of. She calls Pease Air Force Base. She calls the power company. She calls the water company. They all deny having put these helicopters into the air. And Betty begins to suspect a cover-up. Late in life, she produces a memoir called A Common Sense Approach to UFOs. And this memoir describes strange men in black, another common, of course, narrative of conspiracy. It describes black helicopters. It describes government officials coming to see her and telling her not to share what she has seen. In short, by the end of her life, Betty Hill comes to embrace this idea of conspiracy and the notion that there is some sort of cabal happening between earthly powers and extraterrestrial powers. This does not mean, though, that UFOs are entirely threatening to Betty. And here I want to turn to 1967 and the legacy of contact. Of course, George Adamski is well known. This figure who in the 1940s and 1950s claimed to have encountered a Venusian named Orthon, who bore with him messages of peace, spiritual transcendence, the promise that human beings could progress. Adamski, of course, I think is very influenced by the 19th century theosophical movement, sort of esoteric religious movement that combines, I think, a Western interpretation of Eastern religious traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism, with a very, very kind of Western late 19th century Darwinian approach to the world. That describes the world as being and human beings as being in constant evolution, constant development, constant growth. Theosophists would describe ascended masters, right? Intelligent beings that had attained very high levels of spiritual evolution who wish to guide the rest of us. And that is how some people like Adamski interpret UFOs. They are far less interested in the technological and mechanical components, as the state are, than they are in the spiritual meanings of these things. And indeed, some of them, as Jacques Vallée will later write in the late 1960s, come to interpret these UFOs as being perhaps non-material entirely. The Hills begin to learn of this interpretation, of this ways of experiencing UFOs in 1967. And you see here a letter that they receive from Robert Bowman, who was a NICAP investigator, someone they had met with early after their experience in the fall of 1961. He reaches out to them again in 1966, and he has by that point, I think, himself moved in his way of thinking about these strange objects in the sky. He had, in 1961, come to them as a representative of IBM, where he worked, right? And he was very interested in kind of mechanical interpretations of UFOs. But now, notice what he says here. He has grown familiar with the roles of indigenous Americans, with Australian Aborigines, with Indians. He is, as he says here, more and more interested in the why of UFOs, in their spiritual meanings, rather than in simply what they are. And in their ensuing correspondence, Bowman tells Betty Hill that he believes that she is a transducer, which is a technical term, of course, but what he means by it is that he thinks that Betty Hill is in psychic contact with these craft. And he believes that these craft have a mission on Earth, that they're not simply kind of scientific investigators, that they are here to help human beings ascend in their levels of consciousness, to come to new ways of thinking about the world, and that Betty and Barney's experience has some real significant meaning for the entire human race, not simply for the Hills themselves. And so, oh, sorry, I should not have gone forward yet. And so Bowman proposes an experiment. In June of 1967, Robert Bowman, several of his associates, Betty and Barney Hill, Benjamin Simon, and actually Jacques Vallée, camp out for a night in a field in Kingston, New Hampshire. And Betty Hill tries to summon a UFO with her mind. It doesn't happen. Of course, nothing appears that night, but Bowman does not give up. In fact, over the next few months, he sends them many letters describing what he reads as important events happening all over the world that night they were in the field. He thinks that even though a craft did not appear that night, there is a change coming. We might even say a new age dawning. And this contact with Bowman begins to lead the Hills down this other path. Eventually, Betty Hill grows interested in psychic phenomena. She grows interested in channeling. She produces this document, I Am Not Psychic, later in her life, in which she says she tries all sorts of psychic experiments and few of them work. But the title is misleading because Betty does write in this document she comes to believe that she has been reincarnated many times, that she has had past lives, and that her past lives have been directed to put her where she is at this point in time, because she is helping to inaugurate this coming new age. This is to say, right, that Betty comes to believe that her experience is meaningful. In this letter to Stuart Nixon, who is the leader of another important UFO investigation group, she says in the second paragraph there that she actually has psychic impressions about the death of George Wallace and the assassination attempt on him. Right? She comes to see the world then not as seemingly disconnected events, strange occurrences, unidentifiable things. But she comes to understand, I think, the world as an interconnected network, that everything is meaningful, that there are spiritual forces governing both her and UFOs in ways that she does not fully understand. And that is particularly important to her because of Barney's death. Barney dies quite suddenly in February of 1969 of a cerebral hemorrhage. And this, I think the trauma of this event cannot be overstated. And in many ways, I think Betty Hill's pivot in the 1970s and 80s towards these ways of understanding the world and understanding these craft as something more than merely mechanical is a way in which Barney remains close to her. She believes that his death and his life had significance and had meaning. And she believes that until the day she dies. These then are the three different ways we might think about UFOs. The three different ways that the Hills thought about UFOs. But I want to do a little bit of an experiment, something I was just actually thinking about yesterday as I was finalizing this presentation, and say a couple more things about this. In some ways, I think my book is a cop-out. It is cultural history, right? And I follow in this way a really long, I think, and noble and important tradition of exploration of the seemingly strange, the anomalous, the impossible, to use Jeffrey Kripal's term, by showing what it meant, showing how the stories told about these things reflect broader historical processes and forces. And this is a common way that people explain what happened to Betty and Barney Hill. William Kottmeyer's, of course, famous Outer Limits interpretation of the Hills, I think, is a kind of prime example of this. You see on the top right there of the screen, Junior. Junior is a sculpture that one of Betty's friends made of the leader, the creature on the craft that she remembered communicating with. And William Kottmeyer proposes that Junior's appearance, which becomes, of course, the famous appearance of the Greys, right? These small bald creatures with large heads and big eyes, was inspired by an episode of the Outer Limits television show that aired while Betty and Barney Hill were in analysis with Benjamin Simon. That's a kind of quintessential work of cultural history, right? And we see a lot of scholars who work in this way, largely because of what the sociologist Peter Berger has called methodological atheism. That is the idea that human beings are the only creatures with agency, that the supernatural, aliens, ghosts, God, all of these things are merely externalizations and should be analyzed as externalizations. This is how many of the founders of the discipline of religious studies, and I'm thinking here of people like Emil Durkheim or even Freud himself, this is how they thought of religion, right? It is an expression of something else. And that leads us to really excellent books. And I don't want to be disparaging of these authors, like Bridget Brown's really wonderful book on alien abduction. They know us better than we know ourselves, which you see there. In this book, Dr. Brown interviews a woman named Maureen, who is an abductee. And Maureen tells her that one night when she was in bed, she saw long fingers and arms reaching for her through her window. And the next thing she knew, she was on a craft surrounded by small reptilian style aliens who explained to her that she had been implanted with a fetus, although she was not pregnant upon her return. Maureen says she was abducted many, many times and shown her child, an alien human hybrid. And I want to read a quotation that Maureen gives to Brown. I know this sounds so crazy when you tell it, but as I'm telling it, I'm seeing it in my head. Bridget Brown tells us that Maureen is down to earth. She is friendly. She has a good job, a house, a wide social network. What does Brown think is going on here? What does Brown think happened to Maureen? Brown writes, quote, I do not believe in aliens. I do believe, though, that alleged alien abductees believe in their own accounts and that they must be taken seriously for what they tell us about the sense of peril and possibility so many Americans feel. That is to say, right, as I have done, Brown explains alien abduction as a way to explore the loss of control that modern Americans feel. You also see, I think, this approach in many works of religious history. Richard Bushman, who is a friend and mentor of mine, writes about this when he writes about Joseph Smith, who had many visions, right, of God and Jesus Christ and received revelations from God and Jesus. Bushman writes in the introduction to this book, a problem vexes us. Are Joseph Smith's ideas to be attributed to him or to God? Some readers will consider it obvious that his revelations came from his mind and nowhere else. So out of respect for these varied opinions, it would seem judicious to compromise by writing Joseph Smith purportedly received a revelation. But Joseph Smith himself did not think that way. He believed that he was receiving revelations from the divine. And to get inside the movement that he founded, I have to present him, as his early followers thought of him, a revelator. That is to say, Bushman says, he is interested in why people believed that Joseph Smith had revelations. And he is willing to say, simply, Joseph Smith said he did. And so I'm going to follow from that. But that also, of course, feels a bit like a cop-out, which is to say, if Maureen was really abducted by aliens, that's far more interesting than how she tells the story. Just so, if Joseph Smith really saw God, that's a lot more interesting than why people believed he did or did not. It's a lot easier, right, to do it that way, to do what I have done in this presentation and in this book. That is to explore the meaning of these stories, how they're interpreted, why other people might believe them. I want to now just kind of quickly review how a couple of different groups of scholars are pushing that, are trying to propose how we might think about these things in other ways, and offer some quick speculation about how that might help us think about the hills. One, of course, believes or begins, I think, with philosopher and scholar Webb Keane. And that will lead us to hyperobjects, which is, I think, an idea that many of you may be familiar with. But I want to start with Webb Keane before we look at hyperobjects, and before we look at how Jacques Vallée writes about the hills in his diary. Webb Keane is a scholar of modern Christianity. And one of his arguments is that modern Christians, and especially Protestants, and Protestants are important here because they're different from Catholics in ways very significant. Protestant Christians have come to dominate the United States, and were dominating the United States from the 19th century, and dominated Europe. And in this book, Christian Modern, Webb Keane asks a very important question, which is to say, who do we give agency to? When we tell stories about the past, who do we allow to act in those stories? Methodological atheism is one way of saying that only human beings have agency, right? Only human beings do things. And thus, all other agents are at their root simply human beings. That is the argument that Webb Keane makes in this book, that part of the spread of Christianity across the world, and particularly Protestant Christianity, into, for instance, South America, Africa, South Asia, the process of that spread is in part a removal of agency from things that these other societies gave agency to. Nature being one. And indeed, Keene would argue one way we talk about climate change today is by, again, attributing agency only to humans. Humans make nature do things rather than the other way around, but also to spirits, to other beings, to gods, right? And of course, the notion of hyperobjects, which are well, ultimately goes to, I think, the philosopher Bruno Latour, but has been channeled through the literary critic Timothy Morton, and then now the philosopher James Madden, is a way, I think, of thinking about the world around us as having agency in ways that we don't fully understand. Bruno Latour and Timothy Morton argue that, in fact, nature does have agency in ways that we cannot grasp, right? The climate is a hyper object, which is to say, it is a thing that human beings cannot fully grasp. We do not fully perceive the climate. We can't look at all of it at once. It acts upon us in ways that we cannot really interpret. We say things, right, like a storm happened, but we don't know why the storm happened or how the storm will work, not fully. As Morton writes in this book, human beings ourselves, we are less than the sum of our parts. That is to say, each of us, our bodies, are a collection of cells and bacteria and mitochondria and things that are all acting on their own. That kind of creates us, right? But we don't perceive ourselves to be many. We perceive ourselves to be one. UFOs then may be a manifestation of something, a hyperobject we are not actually fully aware of, something that is acting in ways that we don't really fully perceive. And this, I think, speaks perhaps to Jacques Vallée and what he writes in his diary the day after that night that he camped out with the Hills in June of 1967. He suggests here that the true facts of abduction are overlaid by false memory. And there are, I think, two ways we can interpret that passage. One is, I think, a kind of a simplistic way, a kind of a way reminiscent of mid-20th century psychology, which is to say, right, that they were given a false memory, right, that some creature put something in their brain. But I think another way to interpret this is to say that the Hills did not fully understand what happened to them. They did not perceive it in its totality. They could not perceive it in its totality. And so, as Vallée says, the seemingly ludicrous medical examination that comes out of a horror film may be a way for the Hills to understand what went on with them in human terms. Next, anthropologists, and particularly the school of anthropology, sometimes called psychological anthropology. I want to talk first, of course, American Cosmic is a book many of you are probably familiar with, but I want to talk about two books that you might not be familiar with. That is two studies of modern religion in the United States by Tanya Luhrmann, When God Talks Back, and Ann Taves' book, Revelatory Events. Luhrmann, in her book, is discussing an American evangelical Protestant congregation in Southern California. She wants to understand why the people in this congregation perceive God talking to them, why they perceive God acting in their lives, how they understand God blessing them. Ann Taves studies in this book, Revelatory Events, what she calls three new spiritual paths: Mormonism, that is to say, Joseph Smith, Alcoholics Anonymous, and the famous Bill W., who founded Alcoholics Anonymous, and what today we'll call A Course in Miracles, which is based on a text produced by a woman named Helen Schuchman. Each one of these three spiritual paths is founded by a person who said that they had an interaction with a higher power of some sort, a voice, God, right? Some sort of spiritual entity that prompted them and guided them. And both Taves and Luhrmann in these books talk about how this might work. And they describe this perception of higher powers as a mode of spiritual discipline. That is to say, people may be prepped by their culture around them to understand other powers in a specific language. If you're Joseph Smith in the early 19th century, you are surrounded by Protestant Christianity. So you think in terms of God and Jesus, as the people Lerman writes about do as well. But however, if you are, well, for instance, one of the people that Pasulka writes about in American Cosmic, you're thinking in terms of maybe flying saucers or UFOs. But Taves and Lerman propose that human beings are given disciplines, ways to think about interacting with these other beings. For the people Lerman writes about, that is prayer. That is bibliomancy, or searching the Bible for contact with God. For the people Taves writes about, for Bill W., right, it is in some ways meditation. It is group work, right, coming together with other alcoholics. For Helen Schuchman, it was working with other mediums. As these people start to believe that they can contact this other intelligence and this other being, and as they pursue spiritual disciplines that let them do so, they do, in fact, Lerman says, begin to understand things that happen in their lives, feelings that they have, insights that come to them as the work of God. Just so, Ann Taves writes in Joseph Smith, as he began to believe that he could receive revelation, as he worked with other people to write down his revelations, he indeed began receiving them. And this is somewhat of how Pasulka writes about the two key figures in her book. They are people who believe in extraterrestrial craft and who cultivate spiritual disciplines that will allow them to contact and to reach those craft. And as they pursue these disciplines, they do. In a way, then, we could see the Hills experiencing something similar, especially later in their lives. They have a strange experience. They want to make sense of it. They begin pursuing spiritual disciplines, from hypnosis to psychic work, that they believe will allow them to contact that thing. And as they pursue this discipline, they do indeed contact it. Thank you for your time and for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Bowman. That's quite a tour de force of analysis, and I really appreciate this sort of a coda of a critique of your particular point of view. Fascinating. I'm just in the middle of writing notes, so I'm going to turn it over to our discussant for this afternoon, Bill, Professor Dewan, and then we'll jump in. There's so much to talk about, but please, yeah. Bill, if you would.
Thank you, Michael, and Dr. Bowman. That was a great presentation. Again, I had these questions in mind. You I think more food for thought here, especially some of that stuff there at the end that I want to get to. But along with the presentation, I want to say I really enjoyed the book. I recommend everyone here give it a read. It is really fascinating. And as someone who considered himself familiar with a number of aspects of this case, I was taken aback by how much I actually didn't know. And I think your work does an excellent job of really fully fleshing out the lives of not just the Hills themselves, as well as the other key figures that were involved. And I think the other great strengths in my mind is really how well you contextualize this account in this Cold War era, such an important point in our history, and then trace their reframing or meaning of their experience as coinciding with the changing views on the broader American experience. I think that's wonderfully done. So I want to get the ball rolling here with some questions that came to mind for me while reading the book. And then, of course, afterwards, I want to open things up to our other attendees here. So I guess let me start by asking you that you noted that in your interest in the Hill case was born out of your broader interest in American culture in this mid-20th century time, and that their stories seem to capture so many broader events that were occurring then. And again, I say you do a very admirable job of tying this event into the larger Cold War and UFO histories. even again, for those of us largely familiar with the subject. But I think beyond that broader interest, can I ask, how did you first become interested in the subject of UFOs as a whole, your introduction to that? And then how familiar were you with the Hill story before you took on this project?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for it. And thank you for your kind words as well. I was vaguely familiar with the Hills. I knew who they were. I had heard the story, but and I suspect maybe like other people, right? I had thought essentially that I knew everything there was to know about them. I actually came to them a bit by accident. I had originally hoped to write a book about Scientology, but there were a number of really excellent books, particularly Hugh Urban's book, The Church of Scientology, which I would recommend to anybody interested in them. But I was interested in Scientology because I was interested in UFOs. And I was interested in UFOs for this reason. I am primarily a scholar of religion, right? That is my background. That's been my work to this point. And you can, I think, see maybe some of my interest in religion, especially in my last couple of slides there, in my reference to some books about religion. People in religious studies like me, and forgive me for maybe being pedantic to those of you who are aware of what I'm about to say, we are not interested in specific religious traditions, which is to say, right, oftentimes when people on planes hear what I do, they think, oh, you train ministers, right? You're like you teach Protestants what it means to be Protestant, right? That's not the case. Religious studies is the study of religion as a category, which is to say, why do we think some things are religion and other things are not religion? How have we come to, in different human cultures and different human civilizations, right, define the boundaries of religion differently? More to the point, right, religion itself is actually a Western construct. It's something that emerges out of Christianity, right? And it's why many Christians for many, many years didn't refer to Islam as a religion, right? They would call Islam a kingdom or an empire or a nation or something like that. In the United States, then, our ideas of what religion is or is not have really changed over the last 60 or 70 or 80 years, and especially in the Cold War period. We see this kind of redefinition of religion, and really this kind of, I think, unself-conscious assumption that Protestantism is religion and everything else is religion insofar as it looks like Protestantism. One thing that fascinated me, though, about UFOs, and especially UFOs in this early kind of Cold War period, is how UFOs explode those kinds of boundaries. UFOs really make clear, I think, that what we consider to be science, what we consider to be religion, these are artificial distinctions around different types of knowledge and different types of practice that we have created. And I wanted to write about UFOs in the Cold War period precisely to do that, to show how religion and science are constructs, ways of delineating knowledge that are, in the Cold War period particularly, although all the time as well, really shaped by the politics of the period. What is or is not legitimate religion, what is or is not legitimate science, are things that are defined in part by the struggle with the Soviet Union and communism. So that was the initial question that I had. And that's the question that initially took me to Scientology, which I think is a wonderful example of this, because, of course, Scientology begins as a science, right? And then becomes a religion, quite self-consciously. And that's not to kind of poke fun at Scientology or anything, but it is to illustrate how Scientology is a really valuable way of showing the artificiality of these boundaries. But then, as I say, there have been many other wonderful books on Scientology published. So I was casting around for another way to explore this. And as I was looking then at some of the famous cases in this period, I noticed that Kathleen Marden, who is, of course, the niece of Betty and Barney Hill, had very generously, and according to Betty's wishes, donated the Hills papers to the University of New Hampshire fairly recently, in the last 15 years. And of course, for historians, right, a brand new cache of archival material is invaluable. And I just couldn't resist. So I went to New Hampshire to see what was there. And I was prepared, right? There would be a possibility, as is the case with some paper collections, that it's all simply kind of Xerox copies of other people's work, right? Nothing really interesting. But in fact, the Hill collection is really wonderful. There are 2 full boxes of correspondence. There is a whole host of Betty's autobiographical writings, some of which I showed you on screen. There is the possibility of digging really into the Hills story through this collection. And then there are others as well. I'm pretty sure I am the first scholar of the Hills to go and look at John Fuller's papers, which are at Boston University. And Fuller, of course, wrote the first book on the Hills. And that book, The Interrupted Journey, is based, of course, on many pages of interviews that he did with Betty and Barney and with Benjamin Simon. And the complete transcripts of those interviews are in Fuller's papers. There's a lot of stuff in those interviews that he did not put in the book. And there is, of course, a lot of evidence in those transcripts that John Fuller silently edited the Hills and rewrote them and changed things. So that just confirms to me that The Interrupted Journey is just a really, really unreliable source. And it is a shame to me, to the extent that so many people have just relied on it for what really happened with Betty and Barney. So as I began working on this, it came to me that I could do what I wanted to do with this book initially, which is to say, to explore the kind of constructed nature of these categories of religion and science, but also I could really tell their story in a way that had never been told before, and unpack who Betty and Barney Hill were in ways that had never, I think, fully been examined.
Thank you for that response. And I can't stress enough that I really think that I had never seen like this case and their lives more fully fleshed out, through this book, including, of course, you talk about their correspondences, but also, Simon and Fuller. So I really appreciated that. Did an amazing job doing that. Okay, so another question here that comes to mind, thinking about the contrast in their reactions, like terror versus perhaps wonder, from Barney and then to Betty. So I'm going to quote you. You wrote, "The Hills found that theirs," meaning their stories, "came to mean different things to them as their lives continued and as they lived through the turbulent years of the 1960s. Their beliefs about the world around them changed, and their story changed with those beliefs." And I think that's a really interesting observation, and maybe one of the most centrally important points that you make in the book, in my view. It also relates to how I view, like we call memorits in folklore and memory in my own work. And clearly, one thing that's a key component here is how the Hills viewed race and their hopes and their disappointments in the civil rights era. And that's, of course, a big focus in your work. It's also something that others have written about with the Hills before. I know you referenced Christopher Roth, the anthropologist, who wrote about this. And I'm not sure you're familiar with Lucas Tromley's work on this. I couldn't find it. I couldn't find the site in your book, but I might have missed it. But in cases like the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, where, of course, race is clearly a key factor, he's argued that Betty's primary captivity narrative, for instance, like a folklore tradition, that it basically kind of wins out over Barney's initial count of like a focus on racial hostility. And he says the reason for that might be is that captivity narratives, as being this long-standing American literary tradition, they're historically about the white experience in America. In fact, he calls Barney's initial account an extension of actually older slave narratives. Now, again, this is coming from more like literary folklore, but I wonder how would you react to an assessment like that? And if so, is it more of an immediate process of Benny's narrative winning out, or is it really the result of Barney passing away when he did?
Yeah, that's an interesting contrast. And it also brings to mind to me, of course, Susan Lipselter, right, who's written a lot about captivity narratives and abduction stories. And she writes about Betty and Barney in that way. And also, of course, David Halpern's recent book about Barney, right? And Halpern, of course, I think relies overly on Fuller, but he gives a sort of slave narrative interpretation that as well. Yeah, I think there's certainly something to that. As to the winning out, right? The question is, that's kind of a metaphor. What does that actually look like? Does that mean that Betty's narrative becomes dominant in American culture? I think Fuller, right, certainly relies on Betty more than Barney. And I think in some ways that's for two reasons. One is that Fuller, I think, is very, very wary of race as an issue in the mid-1960s. He does not want this book to be racially controversial. And indeed, in that way, right, he's kind of performing his own variety of respectability politics here. He very much downplays race. He tries to erase it from the story. He says it has virtually no impact on it, although clearly, as we've said, it absolutely does. And in that way, then, Fuller embraces, I think, the kind of Betty cycle of storytelling, which is to say, fear and wonder wrapped into each other. Initial fear, which is overcome by wonder and awe and interest, and the ultimate sense that these creatures are friendly and benevolent. That, I think, speaks to, certainly you might say, right, this kind of captivity narrative, although in some ways, well, I'm thinking of like Mary Rowlandson, right, and the sense of redemption ultimately at the end, but also I think redemption kind of tinged and freedom at the end, right? Being liberated, and ultimately captivity affirming the possibility of freedom and liberation and redemption. Captivity being, right, a source of fear that you're then liberated from. But for Betty as well, I think there's always kind of embedded in that the sense that her captors are themselves the bearers, not simply of fear and terror, but of promise, of possibility, of transformation and transcendence. And that comes through, I think, in her hypnosis accounts, more so maybe than in the dream narrative. At the end of her hypnosis, she begs these creatures to come back. She says, "I want to see you again. And she says, I want to introduce you to scientists," which I think speaks to how she's kind of thinking about science, right, in 1964. But that same desire for reunification with these creatures and the possibilities they offer, I think, is also at the heart of this journey she goes on after Barney's death. Right, when Barney's death, I think, it's there before, right? They are kind of they are dipping their toes into the new age before Barney dies, but after he dies, she certainly goes on a journey, and she wants to recover the aliens, right? She wants to bring them back because she thinks they hold ultimately the kind of promise of not healing Barney's death, right, necessarily, but of making his life mean something.
Thank you for that. And as a brief follow-up, this might not be answerable, just a hypothetical, but as I'm reading, the book, I'm thinking, do you think the framing of this narrative and how we now think about it, and even of course now how you've provided a much, I think, broader perspective on this, would it be different maybe in some fundamental important ways if Barney had not passed away like in 1969? Because it seems like you talked about a lot of Betty's reframing afterwards is at least partially rooted in trying to reconcile his death.
Yeah, that's a very fascinating question, and of course, it's hard to answer. Certainly, I think some of the steps she takes after he dies come from her grief. Certainly, but I also want to think about kind of Barney himself and not just how he would be influential on Betty. He is, I think, although not as dramatically as some, but over the course of the 1960s, he is following in some ways how many other African Americans are thinking about race in the United States, which is to say, right, there is this kind of moment of joy and catharsis after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act, this sense of kind of accomplishment. But that accomplishment is pretty quickly dashed. Dashed because of just the escalations of violence that we see in things like Selma and the Watts riots and so on and so forth, and a real pivot among some Black leaders towards Black power and separatism, in the sense that kind of integration is not going to work. Barney has some of that disillusionment himself. We see it, I think, in some of his later writings. And one of the great tragedies, actually, of this book, and I think of me as a historian, is that there just simply is not as much material from Barney's voice as there is from Betty. Betty wrote a lot more than he did. She wrote more letters than he did. She seems to have handled most of their joint correspondence. It's in, letters might be addressed to her or to both of them, but she responds. But there are some things that we have from Barney's own hand, and I think the most important is this speech that he gives later in his life, in which he does say, right, he says essentially that I'm kind of dismayed by what's happened. I'm no longer as optimistic as I used to be. And I suspect, right, that disillusionment that he experiences might have led him to be less concerned with respectability than he is in the early 1960s, and perhaps more willing to explore more kind of radical possibilities, and more willing to join Betty in distrust of the state. Whereas, early on in his life, the state is kind of his great hope, right? He thinks if we can just pass the right laws, we can get rid of racism in America. He doesn't believe that by the late 1960s.
Thank you. And again, I think you do a wonderful job of kind of showing that trajectory of their disaffection, is sort of like emblematic of a broader trend in American life. Okay, so another question here. In the epilogue, you noted that Betty was frustrated with the increasing number of abduction stories that had come out, certainly by the 1980s. And of course, in your presentation too, you referenced Bud Hopkins' work in particular. I'm also wondering, beyond some of the obvious elements, like, the missing time, the medical examinations, of course, hypnosis being a factor, but based on your knowledge or familiarity with subsequent abduction cases, think about Betty and Drazion, the Pascagoula abduction, the Travis Walton case, and of course, into the 80s, the influence of Witness Strieber in Communion. What do you see, or maybe some of the key themes and influences that you find that were passed on from the Hill case? Or based on your understanding, how might you approach some of these later cases perhaps differently?
Yeah, let me just say a bit about her doubts, because that surprised me when I found this in her writings from the 1980s and 1990s, how skeptical she is of people like Bud Hopkins, right? She knows Bud Hopkins, actually. She writes in A Common Sense for UFOs that she had been a guest in his home. But the thing that she seems to be really skeptical of, and that she blames, ironically enough, on bad use of hypnosis. She thinks that Bud Hopkins and Jacobs and these other kind of self-taught hypnotists are not doing it correctly. She clings in an interesting way, I think, to what I suspect were the lingering effects of what I call the kind of flying saucer interpretation on her way of thinking about this that are there in her hypnotic recall. And that is to say, she is very firmly wedded in her story of abduction and how she interprets other abductions that happen later to what we might call like Newtonian physics. Right. She does not like stories in Hopkins's work of people like floating through walls, for instance, or levitating, or creatures just like materializing in rooms, right? The sort of seeming supernatural aspects of it, which I think is a kind of maybe unresolved tension for her with her expressed belief at that same time in channeling and psychic powers and things like that. Right, but she remains, I think, very committed to the sense that her hypnosis was done correctly by a trained person, by an actual psychiatrist, and that it revealed a story of creatures that were essentially, ultimately, despite all of her interest in the New Age, creatures from another planet that had built a craft on that other planet and flown that craft here. That remains really essential to her. However, at the same time, there are, I think, things that we see, maybe traces only in her hypnotic recall that do echo in some of these later stories. And I think more along the lines of people like John Mack than someone like Jacobs or Hopkins. Betty ultimately, right, is optimistic. And her abduction for her, although sometimes frightening, is an optimistic story. It's a story about people essentially who are coming here to help. Right. And I think for Mac, ultimately, that's what Abductions promise as well. And you see in Mac, I think some of the influence of well, the same things that influence Robert Hillman, right? The sense of transcendence of a coming new age. That's certainly, I think, present there. And that's a kind of deep underlying current beyond the sort of obvious things that you mentioned, right, of like missing time and medical examination. And one other I actually will say, and add to that kind of obvious thing, is a real fascination with reproduction. That's only implicit in the Hills, I think, right, in the sort of reference to Barney's genitals and to what Betty later comes to understand as a pregnancy test, right, in her. But it's something that certainly expands a great deal, especially for Hopkins and Jacobs, right? That becomes really, really central to them. I might actually, now that I'm talking about that, I might point to one other thing that doesn't come from Betty and Barney themselves, but I think does really echo in the work of Jacobs and Hopkins. And that is the notion of hybrid children is something that emerges in the critics of Betty and Barney Hill, right? And this is something that, and it's something actually that makes them very, very upset. There was an article that I write about in the book, published in Look magazine, in I think, boy, 1967, I want to say. I might be getting the date wrong, but essentially posits the description of these creatures that emerges from hypnosis. That is to say, small, big heads, and gray-skinned. This writer in Look says, these are essentially the children that the two of you will never have, because he is black and she is white, gray. Right, and that makes Betty furious, and she writes a very, very angry letters about this. But you do see that kind of idea of hybridity, right? That becomes increasingly important in the 1980s and 1990s.
Yeah, thank you for that. And again, I think Christopher Roth, talked about that too, like hybridity as being maybe a through line in different ways, going from the Hill case to, like communion as an example, just maybe a different light. Okay, two more questions for you before I kind of open things up to everyone else. I'm glad you brought up the cop-out angle, because that's been weighing on me as well in my own work, but also, in reading yours. So as someone else who's, academic writing about this topic, I think it's admirable that you take on a decidedly, I'd say, agnostic position about the nature of their experience, but that you are in agreement with Benjamin Simon's assessment of their abduction memories recovered, through hypnosis. And I agree with your perspective there. But and you did talk about this, but I do want to ask you if you do think that scholars in the humanities and social sciences, have we gotten something wrong here? Have we been perhaps even unintentionally reductionistic in downplaying the experiential elements of these narratives, the Rudolph Otto contact with the numinous kind of a thing, even as we rightfully acknowledge how much more complicated like memories actually work than is commonly believed. So I guess in other words, in our focus on cultural and historic contexts and psychological factors, are we intentionally or unintentionally leaving out space for the weird, for the high strangeness, for the numinous, in part maybe based out of fear of others in our field in addressing that?
Yeah, that is really interesting. And in some ways, right, whenever I think of that letter, and I wish I had actually shown it, the letter that Barney writes, actually to Jim McDonald, the guy from Arizona, in which he accuses Simon. Barney says that he thinks Simon doesn't believe them because Simon is afraid of what his peers will say if Simon admits to believing in UFOs. In some ways, I think that's unfair to Simon, right? I don't think Simon is simply acting out of fear. I think Simon is actually interpreting their experiences in a very conventional way for someone as steeped in Freudianism as Simon is. But on the other hand, right, I think there is something to that, because Simon, it's not that Simon is kind of covering up what he really believes, it's that he is shaped by a way of thinking about dreams and hypnosis and reality that are ultimately, as I alluded to, right, many of the late 19th century scholars of religion are reductionist. And so Simon is reductionist too. Freud is a reductionist, in that Freud reduces religion and belief in God to parental issues. Marx is a reductionist. Marx reduces religion and the weird to economics, ultimately. Durkheim, in his way, is also a reductionist, right? And that is baked in, then, in some ways, to how the modern academy thinks. We might say about religion, if we're being grand about it, right? But we might also think of religion as kind of a catch-all term for the weird, the other, the supernatural. What Robert Orsi, a great scholar of Roman Catholicism, who has written critically about the academy on these issues, calls the gods with small g. So certainly, right, and you might have gotten from this little coda that I threw in at the last minute last night as I was preparing this, I do see some of that in myself, and I see some of it in myself in large measure because I think, as I said, right, it's easy to write cultural history and cultural analysis, to do what ultimately is, right, in a sense, reductionist itself, because this mode of writing, I mean, and you know this as a scholar of literature, right? This is going back to kind of the earliest days of critical theory, and the Frankfurt School in the 30s and 40s, right? And the idea that cultural products are a reflection of other things in culture, and we can all just kind of, we can run this kind of lapse of referentiality over and over and over again. That this reflects this, which reflects this, all the way back. But ultimately, right, that mode of analysis, while not to denigrate it, is very revealing and very fascinating, and I think shows us how or why we cloak the weird in the language that we do, right? Why it is that Betty and Barney saw the strange light in the sky and went to flying saucers, as opposed to that was an angel, which is something they might have said 300 years earlier, right? That's what cultural studies and cultural analysis can help us understand, but ultimately, it may not help us actually identify what the light in the sky is, only what we call it. And that is why I'm grateful, as I say, for some scholars like those I referenced, who I think are pushing us in these ways and trying to help us think within the bounds of scholarly discourse about other ways we might approach some of these questions.
I really appreciate the response. And again, I think in a moment, perhaps others, in the chat here can offer their own perspectives, academically on that. Okay, so my last question before we open that up. At the end of the epilogue, you discuss taking the Hill narrative and directing it towards our current concerns in 21st century America. I would love to hear more about that. Like, what relationship do you see between, the sense of social disaffection, spirituality, of course, the growth of conspiracy culture in the current moment, and then maybe what role UFOs might be playing in all of this? To quote Betty from your book, were UFOs coming here because of these changes? So I guess, in other words, are UFOs still playing the same social function now for people they were the post-60s Watergate era? Is this newfound faith among some in the disclosure movements and these whistleblowers and congressional testimony, is this largely a coping mechanism?
Well, largely a coping mechanism, maybe a bit cynical, but to be sure, right, one of the reasons I was attracted to this narrative in the beginning was because I'm interested in what is happening to religion in the United States. In the post-war world. The peak of affiliation with traditional religious denominations in the United States happened in the late Eisenhower years. And ever since then, right, institutions have been on decline. I think there have been some scholars and some people who will say, well, like, religion is on decline, religion is going away. I don't think that's true. I think what is happening is the traditional institutions of religion are vanishing. People today like to use the word spirituality because spirituality seems to them different from religion, by which they mean institutions, right? And I think the path that Betty and Barney Hill take then, which is to say this path away from the denomination they had affiliated with, and towards a much more eclectic bricolage form of spirituality in which past lives can coexist with channeling and automatic writing and contact with extraterrestrial intelligences. All these things can work together is very much, I think, is a path that I think has been accelerated by the fragmentation of modern media and by the increased distrust in institutions. That this is a problem I think that's only getting worse in the United States and has been steadily getting worse for 50 years now. Distrust of institutions coupled with a distrust of traditional authorities. Now, this is not to say, right, that traditional authorities should not be questioned. Sometimes, of course, they should be, right? But I think not in a kind of knee-jerk way that presumes that they are always incorrect and always deceptive and always wrong. That is something I think I see in Betty Hill late in her life, in the 1980s and 1990s, right, in her autobiography. The sense that institutions are to be a priori distrusted. Authorities are to be a priori distrusted. And for her then, the people from Zeta Reticuli that she meant are, interestingly enough, a kind of pure authority for her by the end of her life. They are an authority that can be trusted, an authority that does mean well. They're serving then in that capacity. And I think I see some of that actually in the disclosure community at this point, right? There's something grand and wonderful about to happen. There is a higher power that we can trust as opposed to all the corrupt and broken powers around us. That is very much still with us.
Okay. Yep. Great. Thanks for that answer. All right. So I think I've thrown enough questions at you. So I guess that at this point, I would love to turn things over to those in attendance. Of course, people can sort of raise a hand in the chat to begin, but I want to open the floor to others who have questions for you.
Are there a couple? Let me see if I can open the Q&A. Okay, there we go. Are there a couple in the Q&A? I thought I saw some coming through.
I thought I saw a question earlier, but it seems to have disappeared, at least in my message.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it in the chat, but I am actually not terribly familiar with Google Meet, so forgive me.
There are some questions but they're from me.
Oh,
I
okay.
want to yield to others first, and I will go last. So if anyone else, I have a lot of questions. These are just two that I wrote, but I want to defer to others. Ted, do you have your hand? Are you raising your hand? Yeah. Okay. Ted, can you unmute yourself? Thanks. Yeah, you have to try bottom left. There should be a button. Yeah, there you go.
Can you hear me now? Well, thank you, Matt. I apologize for tuning in late. You may have already answered my question, but here it is. From 1980 to almost 1990, we had the phenomenon of satanic ritual abuse. And hypnosis was used to retrieve forgotten memories. Did Betty Hill weigh in on that? And it looks like they had borrowed Benjamin Simon's hypnotic technique in order to get evidence to put people in jail with. And did she have comments about that? And if you've already said so, just a quick answer will do. Thank you.
I haven't, so thank you for the opportunity to weigh in on that. Off the top of my head, I do not recall her commenting on the satanic ritual abuse scare, although I might speculate a bit as to how she might have felt about it. On the one hand, I could actually see her being somewhat receptive, because by the mid 1980s, right, I think she has the tendency to be fairly open-minded about many stories that she is told. She evinces a lot of sympathy in the 1980s from Bigfoot, for instance. She thinks that Bigfoot is real and that Bigfoot is connected to UFOs somehow. She also certainly believes, and I think this is an important observation about her, she believes by the 1980s that contact between humans and other intelligences is extraordinarily common and ongoing. That people are in touch with spirits. And even she does say she believes at one point in demons as well. So it's possible, I think. But on the other hand, I do think, given her reaction to Bud Hopkins's techniques of hypnosis, which she is quite skeptical of, I suspect she might have been doubtful of a lot of the hypnotic techniques being used in the Satanic Panic as well.
Okay, thank you. Other questions that folks have? Right. Krish? Go ahead, Trish.
I'm using my wife's system here, so I'm not Trish, obviously. Matt, I felt like I was watching a PBS procedural. The way you unfolded this case is just remarkable, and I congratulate you. It's really remarkable scholarship.
Thank you.
It's a scholarship I would have aspired to in my earlier days, but I have to just admire from a distance now. It's really that spectacular. But one thing that came to mind as you're building this set of experiences, I'm interested in this concept of Weltanschauung, Shaung, and it seemed to me like if you were to take the light in the sky as her point of revelation, she developed an entire worldview from that point of view that built from interactions and her own depth. And I wonder if you could talk about that it's kind of like a construction of a personal spirituality out of that revelation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think what I find admirable about Betty Hill, I think, and I like her, and that may come through in the book. I like these people. What I like about her is her sort of ceaseless, relentless gnawing on the problem, which is to say, she has this strange thing in the sky. She points it out to her husband. He doesn't want to stop initially. He tells her, it's just an airplane. It's just a spotlight. It's not something, but she insists. She insists that they stop, and then that kind of, from that insistence comes everything else. But she also returns to it over and over and over again. She never stops thinking about it, asking more questions about it, pushing it in different ways. There are, I mentioned a bit ago, the Hill papers at the University of New Hampshire. There are entire folders in there that are full of Betty Hill apparently just sitting down at a typewriter and starting to write. And I am so grateful to her as a scholar that she doesn't write by hand. She always uses a typewriter, which means she is easy to read. There is a bit I do have in her handwriting, and her handwriting is not terribly easy. But she seems to have processed by writing the story over and over and over again. She tells that story that you reference, right, of her seeing this light in the sky again and again and again at different points in her life. And sometimes it's in letters, sometimes it's in autobiographical statements, but oftentimes it appears she's just doing it for herself. And she brings something new to it almost unceasingly. Every time she writes about it again, she will say, right, what strikes me about it this time is that the wings unfolded. What does that mean? I'm thinking about that, right? So it is correct to say, right, that it's almost, actually, now that I actually hadn't made this connection before this moment, but thinking about Diana Pasulka's work, and her roots in Roman Catholic studies, which I think is really evident actually in how she writes about UFOs. She's, as a fellow scholar of religion, she is obviously, to me, someone who studies Catholics, and I would have known that if she hadn't even written about it. Betty is practicing what Catholics call Lectio Divina, which is to say they're revisiting of a sacred text and the contemplation of it again and again and again. right? There's something very monastic about it, I was about to say. And it is a kind of unfolding of this story, right? And then it may seem simple on the surface, but the deeper you dive into it, the more and more and more is there for her.
Okay. Some other questions from those in attendance. Do you want to tackle one of Michael's questions?
I can read it out for you if I can find it. Here it is. I mean, I let me see. Here it is. There's so many things I would like to cover, from the question of the experience, the ontology imputed to it or derived from it, questions of the formative moments of a religion and the extent to which the UFO experience is participating in the emergence of new religious forms in the United States and elsewhere. These are really fascinating questions, and I want to get to those. But some of the first thoughts I had to ask you about, if you can just sort of comment. I mean, we're in very, it seems, politically unstable, uncertain, and turbulent times, not only in the United States, of course, but around the world. And then today, you know, we're supposed to get some stuff from a whistleblower or state secrets, right? The UFO crash retrieval stuff tonight at 8 o'clock, right? Furthering this, you know, this narrative of government cover-ups and so on. So, to what extent do you think that the work of someone like, you know, Donald Keough and the ensuing UFO controversies in the 50s and 60s, which of course he precipitated in many ways, to what extent do you think that this is constitutive of the distrust in American politics and government that we now see intensifying, you know, especially, you know, sort of congealing around this narrative of the deep state that we've seen grow, you know, ever since, I guess, you know, perhaps the Tea Party and so on, of late. So to what extent do you think that the UFO phenomenon itself is constitutive of this distrust, not just symptom, but like actually constituting it, you know?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. It reminds me actually of, to paraphrase, since I don't recall the exact sentence, but something that Jerome Clark wrote once, which is to say that UFO believers were the first conservatives, right? Which is to say the first people who, in this era of great trust of government, didn't trust the state and pointed to the state and said, you know, you're concealing something, you're doing something wrong. I think that's a little bit overblown. There certainly is, I think, a lot of distrust of the state that emerges in the New Deal period. And there's a lot of people, and especially we should say, you know, we tend to think of them as being largely, you know, wealthy businessmen who didn't like Franklin Roosevelt and what Franklin Roosevelt was doing. But there are a lot of, well, actually American evangelicals who are, you know, calling Franklin Roosevelt the Antichrist in the 1930s and saying that he is creating a kind of tyrannical state along the lines of the paganism that is happening in Nazi Germany and stuff like that. What is interesting about Keough, I think, is, well, Keough later on, in the later 1960s, Keough says that he doesn't believe that Betty and Barney Hill were abducted. He finds their story too incredible. And he says that in a letter, I think a letter to Hynek. His conspiracism, and the conspiracism, I think, of the early UFO movement, is relatively beige. It's a little bit bland. I say beige in reference to the color behind on the wall behind you, Will, right? That it's not terribly lurid, right? It's certainly not the kind of conspiracism that you see from someone like David Jacobs, you know, 40 odd years later. Instead, Kehoe is more or less, he's actually indistinguishable to me from some of the critics of the U.S. nuclear program. And these are people, right? The Manhattan Project was very successful at being kept secret, but after the Manhattan Project, there is a kind of anti-nuclear movement that emerges in the late 1940s and early 1950s that attack the government control of nuclear weapons, right? And say this is not something we should leave in the hands of the state. The state should not have a monopoly on nuclear energy and nuclear power, and they're very critical of nuclear secrecy and all of that. But aside from like Kehoe's stories about aliens building a base on the moon and stuff like that, the stuff that he's accusing the state of doing is not, I think, atypical of critics of the state in the early Cold War period in other ways.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's something to think about there. Just turning to another question. You say that Betty adopted a flying saucer interpretation of her experience, and I found that turn of phrase interesting. It kind of struck me as revealing something perhaps about your approach here, so of something strange in the sky. But I guess my question is the extent to which that is always an interpretation. So, the question here is every experience reported as one of a flying saucer an interpretation, or are some witnesses in fact offering a direct description of the phenomenology, right? I mean, because in many classic cases, they said, no, really, I saw a saucer. It looked like a, and the point is, of course, taken that the flying saucer thing was imputed to the famous Arnold sighting. This was in fact actually an invention by the by the reporter, it seems. But nonetheless, it's some people say no, I really did see it. So what would be your sort of response or reaction to that? Interpretation versus description, I guess, is
yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, now of course, first point being the thing that they saw in the sky, initially it's a light, right? That is how they describe it. Later on, it's sort of a saucer, although not quite. It's a bit boxy with wings. When Betty says, and when I say that she adopts this interpretation, what I'm thinking of is this passage that I put a lot of weight on in the book, which is the question she says that she asks Barney, right, as they're driving home after this whole thing seems to have ended, when she says to him, "Do you believe in flying saucers now?" Yeah. Right, which is, I take that to be not simply, do you think the thing we saw in the sky looked like a saucer, but there's a mythos behind this, right? There's a whole sort of story that she means by that phrase. And when he says no, I think that's significant, right? Because clearly he is not denying that they saw something strange in the sky, right? What he is trying to deny, I think, is the mythos that Betty is inviting him to participate in and to believe in. It is interesting to me, right, that early on, of course, what Arnold saw may have looked like saucers, right, or discs or whatnot. But there are a number of other earlier sightings. I'm thinking here particularly of the Child's Wooded sighting that don't look like saucers. They look like cigars, right, or look like some other sort of thing. But nonetheless, right, that term flying saucer becomes kind of the shorthand for all of these things, and bears with it this sort of particular interpretation.
Yeah, I see the point. I have at least 2 or 3 other questions, but I yield the floor to anyone else. We have a few. Trish, Trish, go ahead. Sorry,
or
Bill.
not Trish, as the case may be.
Or not. That's sorry. Yeah. Now I remember.
Call me your name.
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
God. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm Greg, actually, Greg Wheeler. So Yeah, we're using my wife's system, so that's fine. But
Yeah.
didn't Betty describe a triangular in one of those descriptions with red lights on the side, the classic triangle? Was that, am I wrong in seeing that?
She, excuse me. I actually wish I had put up the picture. There is a little sketch that actually Barney draws at one point. And it is, I mean, it's two-dimensional and it is a crude sketch, but it does appear to kind of have this shape.
Oh, okay.
And then wings unfold from the sides, and there are lights on the ends of the wings, much like actually a jetliner, which is why there are some debunkers who say that that is what they saw.
Okay.
And then the actually imagine a bit like a hamburger shape, and then the meat of the hamburger, Barney says, is a row of windows through which he sees figures.
And Arnold's the flying saucer experience was of winged kind of entities, you know, skipping along the atmosphere, but they also had that wing shape. So
The word he uses is discs. Is it they had discs?
But didn't they have sort of like projections on the side? I mean, I can't remember
Not
the
to
description.
my memory.
Okay,
I might be missing that.
Yeah. Anyway, okay, I just wanted to clarify that. Thanks.
Oh yeah, of course. Scott, you are also muted, Scott.
Yeah, for that last thing with Greg, I have a vague memory of somebody describing something that was boomerang shaped, but that, you know, by the board. I may have already asked you this when we met previously, Matt, but it always seemed to me when I was working with the Betty and Barney material in my own research, it always struck me that Barney's testimony and his emotional reactions and specific comments such as Nazis in uniforms and Irishmen strongly suggested to me that he had experienced violence in the army. Did you come across any archival material? I have not tried to get or see his military records, but it just seemed so emotionally powerful that that would seem to me to have been a trigger for his reactions.
Yeah, certainly. And yeah, he is deeply, deeply discomfited. And it's interesting that he repeatedly, actually before the hypnosis, when he describes these figures, he never actually describes features. He doesn't say, you know, they had big heads or anything like that. He only does it through analogy. He says they looked like Nazis. They looked like Irishmen. Whatever that may mean, right? But certainly it does bear with it this sense of like these are figures, Nazis and Irishmen, that carry emotional resonance for him. He is a World War II veteran. He is in the military in the early 1940s, but he never actually is shipped overseas. He is at a base in the United States and is wounded there by what sounds actually terrible, a grenade mishap. And it does damage to his mouth, which means he wears dentures for much of his life. And this later becomes a point, right? Because Betty describes in her hypnotic recall creatures coming into the room where she is, and then the leader asks her about Barney's false teeth and if all humans can have teeth removed and such like. But yeah, he does not, so far as I am aware, actually see combat at any point, although he is injured in his service, and he's discharged honorably after that grenade accident.
But there's no, well, there might not very well not been an incident, but what it carried me back to is the post-Civil War labor history, where there was tremendous violence, specifically between Irishmen and freed blacks.
Yes, and that seems to be what he is referencing when he says this creature looked like an Irishman, is that kind of history. And it is certainly actually history that he would have been aware of in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, where he grows up, is a place that has kind of urban unrest, racial animosity. There are lynchings in Philadelphia shortly before his family arrives there. right? So these are all things I think that would have resonated with him. He also, and this is actually something that that John Fuller makes something of a big deal about. When Barney is young, he is a bit of a scrapper. He gets into fights at times, and particularly, although Fuller does not play this up, cross-racial fights.
Thank you.
Okay, do you want, there are other questions, or I don't, Mike, you have more to ask as well too.
I do, but if there's anyone else who wants to jump in, I just wanted to tread back on the question of the meditating on the scholarly approach and the presuppositions going in to the study on the one hand, and then this touching on some of the ontological questions, the issues about the the ontological import of the experiences is. I wanted to, when you were talking about the modern academy and academic approaches stemming from 19th century scholarly assumptions that are kind of, as you said, baked in. You mentioned reductionism and so on. I don't know. I would sort of push back on that a bit. I mean, clearly there is a lot of reductionistic thinking, I think, that pervades the academy, but I think a bit more generally, more neutrally, it might. You in fact, you said it yourself. I think you called the position of methodological atheism. So I would even pull back a bit further, sort of methodological ontological neutrality, in a sense, to treat the object of your analysis with a positional neutrality with respect to the ontology of, or the imputed ontology of certain experiences, and to examine those from a kind of a distance, right, a scholarly distance, without taking a position on the veracity of the content of those experiences, but rather framing them in ways that are revelatory of certain cultural or social or political psychological facts, which may vary independently of the ontology itself, right? I mean, perfectly sane people can have extraordinary experiences. Perfectly ordinary experiences could be experienced in ways that are pathological, right? It just, right, there's a kind of measure of independence, and I think that in academic work, what we attempt to instill in our approach is this kind of methodological neutrality or distance, or ontological neutrality and distance from the object. But nonetheless, that there is a question here, right? As a scholar approaching, especially religion, my question here is: so what do you think about the subjective engagement that one might have with the object of their study as a scholar? I mean, how does one balance that against this scholarly objectivity, this kind of distance that we try to achieve to present our subject in an academically objective manner? I mean, in other words, especially in religious studies, and I would say the same would go for also UAP studies, a field that doesn't really exist yet, which I think many of us are trying to create. Some scholars are believers. Some scholars take very definite positions with respect to the object of their study. Others are happy to persist in the kind of neutrality and not make, not take a particular position about it. And some are dismissive. Some are skeptical. Some, right? Like in Buddhism, for example, in Buddhist studies, some believe in Buddhist ontology, some don't. And the same we would hope be extended to scholars in UAP studies. Some take particular beliefs about UAP and experiencers and their testimony. Some are more skeptical and some are neutral. So do you have a comment?
I would refer to, well, what you were calling neutrality is something I think historians, or I was taught in my my graduate work in history, as phenomenology, which is to say, I am going to report what this person says happened to them without passing judgment on it, on the veracity of what happened to them. Instead, I am interested in all of the things that surround that particular event. This is, of course, as I said earlier, what Bushman does in his biography of Joseph Smith. He says, I'm simply going to say, Joseph Smith said he saw a God. And this is why people believed him. This is why other people surrounded him. And that's, I think, that is well and good. And that does, I think, cultivate this sort of neutrality that you describe. This is what the historian of evangelicalism, George Marsden, sometimes describes, right? The meeting ground for academics. If people who do believe, well, for instance, do believe that Muhammad encountered the angel Gabriel in the Hira cave, and the angel Gabriel dictated to Muhammad the Quran. If those people are going to have intelligible conversations with people who don't believe that the angel Gabriel appeared to Muhammad in the Hira cave, they have to set some guardrails up, right? And say, these are the questions that we will ask. These are the questions that we will not ask. And that produces, I think, the sort of work like Richard Bushman's biography of Joseph Smith, right? Or, to be frank, like my book on Betty and Barney Hill, although I do say at one point in the book, like I concur with Simon on the abduction, but I do think they saw something strange. I do think all the explanations I have seen for what the thing in the sky they saw have been unpersuasive to me. But I leave that open. What I think becomes frustrating for some folk, and I think here particularly of Jeff Kripal, who I've had a lot of email exchanges with about my book, is he told me something that I paraphrased in my presentation, which is to say, he asked me, you just say, I don't know what the thing they saw in the light and the sky was, but he says, isn't that the most interesting question here? Isn't that the most important question here? And I don't know if it's the most important, but it certainly is an interesting question. And if we are to tread there, if we are to say what actually happened to Muhammad in the Hira cave, that means we have to take down some of those guardrails that the academy has built around questions that we don't ask, right? And try to find ways to engage with those questions. And that does mean actually that ultimately we might end up having arguments between people who do believe that the angel Gabriel appeared to Muhammad and people who don't, but who might be offering other interpretations for what happened to him. And I don't know, sometimes those arguments are fruitful and useful to have. Sometimes they can be, I think, destructive, to be frank. And it's a really kind of delicate place to go. I mean, I think in my exchange with Kripal, I think he's pushing us in really interesting and useful and provocative ways. I also think Jeff's kind of disdain for traditional religion is something that I find less useful. But yeah, and that will lead, I think, to further kind of disputes and debates. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Greg?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to make a comment. I mean, we're talking so many issues, it's hard to keep track, but I'm really interested. I mean, I have to say that I'm very influenced by Bultmann and Robinson, that, we talk about Muhammad, or we talk about the first century religion. It was heavily in a pristine world of mythology. Okay. And he just asserts this, that we're thinking mythologically here, and we need to separate out the mythology of the first century worldview, which includes things like redemption and faith and, even resurrection and Jesus ascending into the heavens. I mean, like I wanted to say to people, if you really ask, where did Jesus go? I mean, it poses a worldview question there about what the heavens mean to the first century. So I think in terms of the way we've been approaching, Scott and I, in terms of this, the unidentified is still unidentified. We're still in that position. some people believe they've identified what they are, but the stance of the open mind is we don't know, right? So that neutrality is part of our understanding level at this point. And I think we have to really be careful about separating out the mythologies, you know, like the Betty Hill worldview that established from her revelation, from what's in the sky, right? That's another question. That's a separate, for me, a phenomenologically different question. So, and I know that that betrays my biases, because I am saying mythology is part of the human history of dealing with the unknown. That is not an unusual thing in human history. There is plenty of revelations from angels and ghosts and, you know, transcendent experiences. As a psychologist, I have to say the brain is very complicated. And I know that, you know, I mean, you could say schizophrenia is a good example of how complicated it can get. The what was the movie, The Pristine Mind? You know, that movie. You can create a complete world that is totally believable, and people have written volumes of. I mean, Tolkien. Think of that. 1 million pages of a constructed world out of his own brain. That's what's there. So I think you have to be really careful not to dismiss what science is telling us about the brain and psychology in terms of, you know, phenomenological events being external or internal. And it's, I mean, I just assert that. So without any scholarship to back it up, but there you go. So just wanted to say.
No, thank you.
Did you want to comment, Matt, on that, or just?
Yeah, right. I think that's fundamentally, I think, a true thing, right? Is that there are two things here. There is the light in the sky, the event, the thing itself, and then how we interpret it, the meanings we wrap around that event. And the latter, I think, is pretty traditionally what scholarship has done with the weird. To use Will's term, we have looked at how do we interpret the weird? What are the meanings we bring to the weird? But less so, you know, what is the weird itself? Can we actually understand the weird, or is it fundamentally not understandable? I think of the great scholar of religion, Jonathan Z. Smith, wrote a really excellent essay about Jonestown and Jim Jones. It's called The Devil in Mr. Jones. And in that essay, Smith argues, well, he points to much of the media surrounding, you know, the tragedy at Jonestown, right? The tragedies of the mass suicides and the deaths and all of that. And he points to all of this media describing this as understandable. No, not understandable. It is baffling. It is a mystery. Jim Jones was simply evil. He was psychotic. He was crazy. All of these words. And Smith argues what all of these words are is an excuse not to understand. They are a way of putting Jim Jones beyond the reach of human comprehension. And the purpose of the humanist, the examination of the human condition, is to understand, is to try to get at, as close as we can, to what this thing is. And that's why I think I'm increasingly kind of sympathetic to some of these folks, like Ann Taves, right, who uses a psychological approach and tries to understand what actually was happening to Joseph Smith, beyond just saying, right, he said he had revelations from God. That's well and good. But what was actually going on in his head? How was he producing these things? Maybe these are ultimately questions we cannot interpret, but it doesn't mean we cannot try, and cannot try to leverage some of the tools of scholarship in an attempt to grapple with them. And those tools might be psychological, right? They might be actually like psychiatric, brain chemistry and such like. And Taves is doing a lot of interesting work with that these days. And they might be, you know, philosophical or other tools entirely.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, there's much more to dive into here, and we could probably go on for another few hours, certainly. But If there's no other question, I think we should probably close for this afternoon. Thank you so much again, Professor Bowman, and also Professor Dewan. Thank you for your excellent series of questions to spark our afternoon of questions here. Thank you again, everybody, for joining the Society for our colloquia, and hopefully we